Imagine walking up to a perfectly ordinary ATM. You have done it hundreds of times. You slide in your card, punch in your PIN, collect your cash, and walk away without a second thought. The machine sits in the corner of a gas station or a shopping mall entrance, humming quietly, doing exactly what it was designed to do: predictable, reliable, boring. Now imagine that someone has convinced 51 banks and thousands of investors that they own one of those machines, except the machine doesn't exist. Or it exists but never works. Or it works sometimes but generates a fraction of the income printed on the monthly statement that arrives so reliably in every investor's inbox that no one ever thinks to question it. That is the story of Daryl Heller and Paramount Management Group. And by the time federal prosecutors had traced the full shape of what he built, the number had reached $770 million, collected from people who believed they had found the safest, most boring investment in America. Here is where you need to start, not with the fraud itself, but with the psychology underneath it. There is a specific type of investor that financial predators understand better than anyone else in the room, not the greedy speculator chasing 10 times returns. Not the first-time investor dazzled by something new and exciting. The real target is the careful one, the one who has spent 20 or 30 years building a nest egg through discipline, through patience, through a deep and entirely reasonable fear of losing what a lifetime of work produced. The target is the person who specifically wants nothing exciting, who wants slow, steady, predictable returns on a physical asset they can picture in their mind. ATMs are almost the perfect vehicle for this. They sit in high-traffic public locations. They charge a transaction fee typically between $2.50 and $4 every single time someone withdraws cash. Multiply that across hundreds of machines and thousands of monthly transactions, and the math looks very clean on a spreadsheet. No stock market volatility, no quarterly earnings surprises, no executive scandal to move the share price overnight. Just cash dispensed, fee collected, return delivered. Daryl Heller understood this. He built Paramount Management Group around this exact understanding, and he packaged it into a product that looked, on every surface level, exactly like what serious, conservative investors had spent years searching for. The mechanism was a sale-leaseback arrangement. This is a real and widely used financial structure. You, the investor, purchase one or more ATMs from Paramount. Paramount then leases them back from you and operates them on your behalf. Each month, you receive your contracted return, a fixed percentage of your original investment, derived supposedly from ATM fee revenue. Paramount takes a management fee for running the machines. Everyone profits. The arrangement is clean, logical, and easy to explain at a dinner table without a single chart or diagram. Sale-leaseback financing is used across commercial real estate, the aviation industry, and industrial equipment markets. It is a completely legitimate mechanism. Boeing uses it, airlines use it, major logistics firms use it. But what Heller had discovered was that this particular structure was also almost impossible to audit quickly, especially when the assets in question are hundreds of individual machines scattered across multiple states. Because here is what was actually happening inside Paramount. A significant number of the ATMs that investors were told they owned did not exist. Of those that did exist, many were old, broken, or placed in locations that generated almost no transaction volume. The monthly returns being paid to investors were not coming from ATM fee revenue. They were coming from the capital contributions of new investors. Every dollar paid to someone who joined early was funded by a check written by someone who joined later. The business had no real operating engine. It was a closed loop, money flowing in from the newest participants, money flowing out to the oldest ones, with Heller and his associates extracting enormous sums from the middle. This is the structure of a Ponzi scheme, not a new invention, not a sophisticated financial instrument engineered to obscure its own nature. A model first documented in America in the early 1920s, named after Charles Ponzi, a Boston-based Italian immigrant who convinced investors he had found a postage stamp arbitrage opportunity that didn't quite work the way he described it. 100 years later, the fundamental mechanics haven't changed at all. What changes is the packaging. Heller's packaging was exceptional. Paramount had offices. It had staff. It had the vocabulary and the presentation of a functioning mid-sized American company. It produced monthly statements. It sent site inspection reports. It supplied serial numbers for machines. It generated a paper world that corresponded in almost every detail to what a legitimate ATM management business would look like on the outside, except that the physical world underneath it was substantially hollow. He didn't stop at individual investors. He took his pitch to institutional lenders, to banks, to credit unions, to the commercial financing arms of organizations whose entire business model is built on skepticism. He walked in with portfolios, spreadsheets of machine locations, transaction histories, cash flow projections with footnotes, and he walked out with checks. 51 separate financial institutions extended capital to Paramount based on the collateral of ATMs that were either fictitious or wildly overvalued. The total collected from investors and lenders combined reached approximately $770 million. Consider for a moment what $770 million actually represents at this scale. It is not the result of one or two massive transactions. It is the accumulated result of thousands of individual acts of trust, a retiree here, a small business owner there, a regional bank lending officer reviewing a portfolio document on a Tuesday afternoon and deciding the collateral looks solid enough to approve. It is a fraud that scaled because trust scaled. Because each successful payment to an early investor created the conditions for the next investor to believe without question. This is the self-reinforcing logic at the center of every Ponzi structure. The payment itself is the advertisement. When your monthly return arrives on time, you don't question it. When your neighbor tells you theirs arrived on time too, you don't question it either. The entire system is held together by the appearance of function, and the appearance of function is maintained right until the moment it isn't, by the continuous pressure of new capital flowing in. So how does a structure like this survive the scrutiny of 51 separate lending institutions? The answer lives in a concept called collateral verification, and in the gap between what financial institutions are supposed to do and what they actually do under competitive pressure to deploy capital. When a commercial lender extends a loan backed by physical assets, they are theoretically obligated to verify that those assets exist, that they are operational, and that their value corresponds to what the borrower claims. In practice, this verification often relies heavily on documentation provided by the borrower, supplemented by spot checks rather than comprehensive audits. When a portfolio contains hundreds of machines spread across dozens of different locations in multiple states, a complete independent inspection becomes expensive, time-consuming, and logistically difficult to justify on a single deal. Heller understood this gap precisely. He built his documentation around it. He provided exactly the level of paperwork that would satisfy a standard review. And he built enough apparent operating history, years of on-time payments, signed lease agreements, plausible transaction records to make a deeper investigation feel unnecessary and even slightly insulting to raise. And here is the competitive dimension that regulators rarely discuss openly. When multiple lenders are simultaneously competing to deploy capital into what looks like a low-risk, asset-backed portfolio, the internal pressure to approve quickly and ask fewer questions increases. The lender that demands 6 weeks of independent verification risks losing the deal to a competitor willing to close in too. This competitive dynamic doesn't excuse the failures of individual institutions, but it explains structurally how 51 of them can each make a version of the same mistake. Now, bring this back to your own financial decisions, because this is the part that matters most. The instinct, when you read about cases like Paramount Management Group, is to assume that the victims were either reckless or unsophisticated, that they should have spotted the warning signs, that you would have asked the right questions. But that assumption is both wrong and dangerous. The people who lost money to Daryl Heller were not gamblers. They were not chasing something they knew was too good to be true. They were, in many cases, the most cautious investors in any room they walked into. They had specifically sought out the boring option, the physical asset, the modest monthly return, the investment that looked nothing like a high-risk bet. The real lesson from Paramount is not that passive income is a myth. The lesson is that the absence of excitement is not the same thing as the presence of safety. And the most dangerous financial product is the one that has been specifically designed to feel like the safest option available. There is one practical step one habit that would have protected almost every person who lost money to Daryl Heller. It is called independent asset verification. Before placing capital into any structure that promises returns on a physical asset you supposedly own, you verify that asset through channels that have no connection to the person selling it to you. You don't read the documents they provide. You don't study the projected cash flows they have formatted so professionally. You find the machine. You call the location directly. You hire a third-party inspector who has never heard of Paramount Management Group, who has no financial relationship with anyone in the deal, and who physically confirms that the thing generating your promised monthly income actually exists somewhere in the real world, not just on a spreadsheet with a professional logo in the top corner. This sounds obvious, and it is. The reason it doesn't happen consistently is that the most skilled fraudsters in history have learned to make independent verification feel like an insult. They build an atmosphere in which asking for third-party proof signals that you don't belong among serious investors, that you're wasting everyone's time, that you clearly don't understand how this works. That feeling is not accidental. It is engineered. It is the most important layer of the product. Daryl Heller was arrested, charged with securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering, and convicted by federal prosecutors. The victims numbered in the thousands. The losses were measured in the hundreds of millions. And for most of the people who were defrauded, recovery through asset seizures and court-ordered restitution will cover only a fraction of what was taken. The ATMs, in many cases, were never found, because many of them were never there. That is the image to hold on to. A network of machines spread across America on paper, existing more completely on spreadsheets than on any actual floor in any actual building. A fraud that didn't arrive with flashing lights or implausible promises of overnight wealth. A fraud that introduced itself as the safest, most predictable, most professionally managed investment you had ever been offered, and then quietly collected everything you trusted it with. In 2025, federal courts heard the full accounting of what Daryl Heller built with $770 million, and a precise understanding of what the most careful investors in America were desperate to find. And the machines were never humming in the corner of a gas station. The most sophisticated piece of equipment in the entire operation was the one dispensing trust, one perfectly timed monthly statement at a time.